The garden was quiet that evening, the air filled with the subtle scent of blooming jasmine and freshly cut grass. It was my place of solitude, where I came to find peace after long days, to collect my thoughts. I didn't expect anyone to be there, especially not my stepmom, Laura. She was usually busy with her work, bustling around the house with an air of grace and focus that I had always admired from afar. Yet here she was, standing in the golden light, her face softened by the warmth of the setting sun. Laura noticed me before I could think to say anything, her gaze meeting mine with a look of gentle surprise. "I didn't know you'd be out here," she said, her voice as soothing as the evening breeze. She held a basket filled with flowers she'd been picking, a small gesture that made her look so serene, so effortlessly graceful. "I didn't mean to disturb you," I replied, finding it hard to look away. There was something about her that evening, an elegance in the way she stood, the way she looked at me with a calm understanding that left me feeling unexpectedly captivated. She smiled, a small, knowing smile that seemed to hold 100 unspoken words. "You're not disturbing me at all. This is your garden too." We stood there for a few moments, the silence between us filled with a warmth I couldn't quite place. As she took a step closer, I felt my heart skip a beat, an awareness of her presence settling over me in a way that felt both comforting and unsettling. The unspoken familiarity between us, something that had always been there, seemed to grow stronger, each quiet glance, each gentle movement, speaking volumes. "Do you mind if I join you?" she asked, her voice soft, almost hesitant, as though she, too, felt the subtle shift in the air between us. I nodded, gesturing to a bench nearby. "Of course." We sat together, surrounded by the vibrant colors of the garden, the petals of roses and lilies bathed in the soft glow of dusk. Laura set her basket down and smiled, feeling a warmth settle over me that had little to do with the golden light of the sunset. "Yeah, I come out here a lot in the evenings," I replied, trying to keep my tone casual, though I couldn't shake the feeling of something significant hanging in the air between us. Laura set the basket down on a small bench near the garden path and took a step closer, her gaze lingering on mine with the softness that I hadn't noticed before. "It's a beautiful place, isn't it?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I come here sometimes to clear my mind, to feel grounded." I nodded, watching her as she stood there, her eyes drifting over the garden as if seeing it for the first time. The way the fading sunlight highlighted her features made her look ethereal, almost dreamlike. I felt my heart quicken, and for a moment I was struck by a quiet vulnerability in her gaze, as though she were sharing a part of herself that she rarely let others see. Without thinking, I took a step closer to her, feeling an inexplicable pull that I couldn't ignore. "I didn't know you felt that way about this place," I murmured, the words slipping out before I could stop them. She looked at me then, really looked at me, and in that moment, there was a shared understanding that passed between us, a silent acknowledgement of something deeper, something that neither of us could quite name. Her hand reached out, brushing against mine in a touch that was gentle, almost tentative, and the simple contact sent a spark through me, grounding me and filling me with a warmth that settled somewhere deep. "I feel like there's so much I don't know about you," Laura said softly, her hand lingering near mine, her gaze filled with a quiet intensity that left me breathless. "You're not a kid anymore. I keep forgetting that." Her words struck a chord, and I felt a surge of emotions, both familiar and foreign, rise within me. "And I forget how much you've done for me," I replied, my voice soft, filled with a vulnerability that surprised even me. "You've always been there supporting me, more than I realized." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken words, with a tension that felt as though it had been building for a long time, hidden beneath the surface, waiting for a moment like this. She took a small step closer, her hand slipping into mine, and the warmth of her touch filled the quiet space between us, grounding us in the reality of the moment. Laura's gaze softened, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. She let out a soft sigh, her fingers tracing gentle patterns along the back of my hand, a touch that felt both comforting and electric. "I suppose life is filled with unexpected moments," she murmured, her voice barely audible, almost as if she were speaking to herself. I felt my heart race, the air between us charged with a tension that was as thrilling as it was terrifying. "Sometimes, I feel like we understand each other in ways I can't explain," I admitted, my voice trembling slightly as I spoke, the words spilling out before I had a chance to hold them back. Her hand tightened around mine, and I saw a flicker of something in her gaze, an emotion that mirrored my own, something deep and unspoken, yet undeniable. Maybe that's because we do, she replied, her voice soft, filled with a warmth that left me breathless. The garden was silent, the only sound the gentle rustling of leaves as the evening breeze drifted through. We stood there, lost in each other's gaze, the world around us fading away, leaving only the quiet connection that had grown between us, a bond that felt as natural as breathing. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the garden, Laura took a step back, her hand slipping from mine, her gaze lingering on me with a mixture of longing and restraint. "We should probably go back inside," she murmured, her voice filled with a reluctance that mirrored my own. I nodded, feeling the weight of the moment settle over me, a quiet acknowledgement of the line we had just approached, the line that neither of us had dared to cross. "Yeah, you're right," I replied, though a part of me wanted nothing more than to stay here with her, to hold on to this moment a little longer. We walked back to the house side by side, our hands occasionally brushing, each touch sending a thrill through me that I couldn't ignore. The silence between us was filled with unspoken words, with a quiet understanding that neither of us dared to voice. And as we stepped inside, I couldn't help but feel that something had shifted between us, something beautiful and complicated, something that would forever change the way we saw each other. The days that followed were filled with a quiet tension, each moment in Laura's presence weighted with the memory of our evening in the garden. It was as if that shared moment had created a bond between us, something subtle yet profound, that we both sensed but were too hesitant to acknowledge. Every glance, every shared silence seemed to carry a deeper meaning now, a quiet awareness that lingered between us. I found myself drawn to the garden more often, seeking the peace and solitude it offered, but also hoping secretly that Laura would join me there again. She had always been a grounding presence in my life, someone I looked up to, respected. Yet now there was something else, a quiet thrill, a spark that felt both exhilarating and forbidden. One evening, as the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the garden, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see Laura approaching, her expression soft, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. My heart quickened, the anticipation building as she walked over to where I stood, her gaze holding mine with a quiet intensity. "I had a feeling I might find you here," she said, her voice gentle, almost as if she were trying not to disturb the delicate atmosphere that had settled over the garden. I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through me at her words. "It's become a place of peace for me," I replied, my voice soft. "Somehow, it feels like I can think clearly here." Laura nodded, her gaze drifting over the flowers, the soft rustling of leaves filling the silence between us. "I know what you mean," she murmured. "It's a place where everything else fades away." We stood there in silence, each of us lost in our thoughts, the air between us filled with an unspoken understanding, a quiet companionship that felt both comforting and electric. After a moment, she reached out, her fingers brushing against mine, and I felt a thrill race through me, the warmth of her touch grounding me in the reality of the moment. "I've been thinking about that evening," she said softly, her gaze meeting mine, a vulnerability in her eyes that made my heart ache. "About the connection we share. It's something I didn't expect." I swallowed, feeling my throat tighten as I searched for the right words. "Me neither," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper, "but it feels real." Laura's hand slipped into mine, her fingers interlacing with mine in a gesture that felt both grounding and intimate. Sometimes I wonder if we're both just looking for understanding, for someone who truly sees us. Her words struck a chord deep within me, a feeling of being seen, understood, in a way I hadn't before. "I think you're right," I murmured, my gaze never leaving hers. "With you, it feels like I can be myself, like I don't have to pretend." The silence that followed was filled with a quiet intensity, a shared vulnerability that seemed to draw us closer, binding us in a way that felt both beautiful and dangerous. Laura's hand tightened around mine, her gaze soft, filled with an emotion that mirrored my own. For a moment, we simply stood there, our hands entwined, the world around us fading away, leaving only the warmth of her presence, the quiet strength of our connection. I felt the weight of the unspoken words between us, the line we were approaching, and yet, in that moment, I couldn't bring myself to pull away. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the garden, Laura took a small step closer, her gaze holding mine with an intensity that left me breathless. "There's something between us, isn't there?" she whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of longing and uncertainty. "Yes," I replied, the words slipping from my lips before I could stop them. "But I don't know what it means." Her hand lifted to my cheek, her fingers gentle as they brushed over my skin, and I felt a shiver run through me, a thrill that left me trembling. "Maybe we don't need to know," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "Maybe it's enough to just feel it." Our breaths mingled in the quiet space between us, and I felt myself leaning into her touch, drawn to the warmth, the comfort, the quiet beauty of her presence. It was a feeling that left me vulnerable, exposed, yet filled with a sense of peace, of belonging. When her lips met mine, it was a soft, tentative kiss, filled with a gentleness that took my breath away. Her hand cradled my face, her touch warm and steady, grounding me in the reality of the moment. The kiss deepened, each touch, each caress, a quiet exploration, a dance of shared understanding that left me feeling both exhilarated and safe. We pulled apart, breathless, our foreheads resting together as we stayed wrapped in each other's embrace. The world around us felt still, as though time itself had paused, leaving only the two of us, bound together in the quiet, beautiful connection we had found. "I don't know what this means," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly, filled with a mixture of fear and longing. "But I know I don't want to lose it." I nodded, feeling a tear slip down my cheek, the weight of our emotions settling over me like a soft blanket. "Me neither," I replied, my voice filled with a quiet resolve. "Whatever this is, it feels too important to ignore." We stood there in the fading light, holding each other close, letting the silence speak the words we couldn't say. It was a moment filled with both beauty and pain, a reminder of the complexity of love, of the quiet magic of unexpected connections. As the evening deepened and the world grew quiet around us, I felt a peace settle over me, a warmth that filled every inch of my being, grounding me in the beauty of the moment, in the quiet magic of our bond. The days that followed were a blend of longing and restraint, an emotional tug-of-war that weighed heavily on both of us. Each encounter with Laura, each shared glance, each fleeting touch, carried with it the memory of that evening in the garden, the moment we had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. And yet, despite the guilt that lingered, there was a warmth, a quiet joy in knowing that we shared something profound, something that bound us together in ways we hadn't anticipated. We found ourselves navigating this new dynamic carefully, trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy while hiding the depth of our connection. Our conversations grew softer, our gestures more thoughtful, and in every small interaction, I could feel the unspoken understanding between us, the silent acknowledgement of the line we had crossed, and the feelings that had blossomed in its wake. One afternoon, as I wandered through the house, I found myself drawn to the garden once more. It had become a sanctuary, a place where the world seemed to fall away, leaving only the warmth of memories and the quiet comfort of solitude. As I walked along the garden path, I heard footsteps behind me and turned to see Laura standing there, watching me with a soft smile, her gaze filled with a warmth that left me breathless. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as though she didn't want to disturb the peace of the garden. "Of course not," I replied, my heart racing as she walked over to me, her presence grounding me, filling me with a quiet joy that I couldn't ignore. We walked in silence for a while, our hands occasionally brushing, each touch sending a thrill through me, a reminder of the bond that had grown between us. The air was thick with unspoken words, with a tension that felt both thrilling and bittersweet, as we navigated the delicate balance between the beauty of our connection and the reality that lay beneath. After a while, Laura paused, her gaze drifting over the flowers as though she were lost in thought. "I don't think I ever told you how much this garden means to me," she murmured, her voice soft, filled with a vulnerability that made my heart ache. "It's a place where I feel free, where I can just be myself." I looked at her, feeling a surge of emotion, a quiet understanding that went beyond words. "I think that's why I come here too," I replied, my voice filled with a softness that mirrored her own. "It's like everything else falls away and all that's left is this moment." She turned to me then, her gaze meeting mine with an intensity that left me breathless. "Yes," she whispered, her fingers reaching out to brush against mine, a gentle touch that felt both grounding and electric. "It's a rare thing, isn't it, to find a place where you feel truly at home?" The silence between us was thick with unspoken words, with a tension that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. I felt her hand slip into mine, her fingers interlacing with mine in a gesture that held both warmth and comfort, grounding us in the reality of the moment. "There's something about you," she began, her voice trembling slightly, her gaze filled with a mixture of longing and restraint. "Something that makes me feel alive in a way I haven't felt in a long time." Her words struck a chord deep within me, a feeling of being seen, understood, in a way that left me vulnerable, exposed. "I feel the same way," I replied, my voice barely a whisper. "With you, it feels like I can be myself, like I don't have to pretend." The silence that followed was filled with a quiet intensity, a shared vulnerability that seemed to draw us closer, binding us in a way that felt both beautiful and dangerous. Laura's hand tightened around mine, her gaze soft, filled with an emotion that mirrored my own. We stood there, our hands entwined, the world around us fading away, leaving only the warmth of her presence, the quiet strength of our connection. I felt the weight of the unspoken words between us, the line we had crossed, and yet, in that moment, I couldn't bring myself to pull away. As the evening light cast a warm glow over the garden, Laura took a step closer, her gaze holding mine with an intensity that left me breathless. "There's something between us, isn't there?" she whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of longing and uncertainty. "Yes," I replied, the words slipping from my lips before I could stop them. "But it's complicated." Her hand lifted to my cheek, her fingers brushing over my skin in a touch that was both gentle and grounding. "Maybe it doesn't need to be," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "Maybe. It's enough to just feel it." Our breaths mingled in the quiet space between us, and I felt myself leaning into her touch, drawn to the warmth, the comfort, the quiet beauty of her presence. It was a feeling that left me vulnerable, exposed, yet filled with a sense of peace, of belonging. When her lips met mine, it was a soft, tentative kiss, filled with a gentleness that took my breath away. Her hand cradled my face, her touch warm and steady, grounding me in the reality of the moment. The kiss deepened, each touch, each caress, a quiet exploration, a dance of shared understanding that left me feeling both exhilarated and safe. We pulled apart, breathless, our foreheads resting together as we stayed wrapped in each other's embrace. The world around us felt still, as though time itself had paused, leaving only the two of us, bound together in the quiet, beautiful connection we had found. "I don't know what this means," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly, filled with a mixture of fear and longing. "But I know I don't want to lose it." I nodded, feeling a tear slip down my cheek, the weight of our emotions settling over me like a soft blanket. "Me neither," I replied, my voice filled with a quiet resolve. "Whatever this is, it feels too important to ignore." We stood there in the fading light, holding each other close, letting the silence speak the words we couldn't say. It was a moment filled with both beauty and pain, a reminder of the complexity of love, of the quiet magic of unexpected connections. As the evening deepened and the world grew quiet around us, I felt a peace settle over me, a warmth that filled every inch of my being, grounding me in the beauty of the moment, in the quiet magic of our bond. The days that followed were a delicate dance, each moment with Laura filled with a quiet intensity, a longing that grew stronger every time we were near each other. There was a warmth between us that couldn't be ignored, a connection that felt as though it had woven itself into the fabric of our lives, binding us together in ways both thrilling and terrifying. We navigated this new closeness with care, each encounter a careful balance between restraint and the quiet pull that seemed to draw us together, no matter how hard we tried to resist. One evening, as dusk settled over the garden, casting everything in a soft, golden glow, I found myself there again, wandering among the flowers, lost in thought. The air was warm, fragrant with the scent of jasmine, and as I stood there, I felt a presence behind me. I turned to see Laura, her face softened by the fading light, her gaze holding a mixture of vulnerability and resolve. Without a word, she walked over to me, her hand reaching out to take mine, her fingers intertwining with mine in a gesture that felt both familiar and electrifying. She stood close, her presence grounding me, and for a moment, we simply held each other's gaze, the air thick with unspoken words, with a connection that felt as if it were a force of nature, impossible to deny. "I don't think I can keep pretending this isn't real," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "What we have. It's something I never expected, something that feels too important to ignore." Her words resonated deeply within me, a quiet affirmation of everything I had been feeling but hadn't dared to voice. "I feel the same way," I replied, my voice soft, filled with a vulnerability that left me exposed. "But I don't know where this leads, or what it means for us." Laura's hand lifted to my cheek, her fingers brushing over my skin in a touch that was both gentle and grounding, a reminder of the bond we shared, the connection that had grown between us, beautiful and complicated. "Maybe we don't need to know right now," she murmured, her gaze filled with warmth, with a quiet intensity that took my breath away. "Maybe it's enough to just be here, to hold on to this moment." I felt a tear slip down my cheek, the weight of her words settling over me like a soft blanket, grounding me in the reality of our bond. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice barely audible, "for seeing me, for everything." We stood there in the fading light, our hands entwined, the world around us falling away as we sank into the quiet magic of the moment. Her lips met mine in a gentle, lingering kiss, filled with a tenderness that left me breathless, a reminder of the depth of our connection, of the bond we had built in the quiet spaces of shared understanding. The kiss deepened, a slow, deliberate dance of shared vulnerability, each touch, each caress, filled with a warmth that felt both exhilarating and safe. Her arms wrapped around me, pulling me close, and I felt myself melt into her embrace, surrendering to the quiet beauty of the moment, to the comfort of her presence, to the undeniable pull that had brought us here. When we finally pulled apart, our foreheads resting together, I felt a peace settle over me, a warmth that filled every corner of my being, grounding me in the reality of our connection. Her hand slipped back into mine, her fingers intertwining with mine in a gesture that felt both simple and profound, a silent promise of everything we had shared. We stayed like that for a while, wrapped in each other's warmth, letting the silence speak the words we couldn't say, the world around us fading into the background, leaving only the two of us, bound together in a bond that felt as natural as breathing. When it was finally time to part, we shared a soft, lingering embrace, a quiet affirmation of everything we had come to mean to each other. There was no clear resolution, no tidy ending, only a shared understanding that whatever this was, it was something we would carry with us, a connection that would forever remain a part of who we were. As I walked back to the house, I felt a quiet joy settle over me, a warmth that filled every inch of my being, grounding me in the beauty of our bond, in the quiet magic of our shared moments. Our paths might be uncertain, the future unknown, but in that moment, I felt a peace, a contentment that reminded me of the strength of our connection, of the beauty of everything we had shared. That night, as I lay in bed, my mind drifted back to the garden, to the warmth of Laura's touch, to the softness in her gaze, and I felt a quiet happiness wash over me, a joy that lingered long into the night, filling me with the memory of her, of us, of the quiet, beautiful bond we had built together. In the end, there was no clear resolution, no easy answer to the questions that lingered. Our story remained an unfinished chapter, a memory filled with longing, beauty, and complexity. And though the future might be uncertain, the bond we had shared would forever remain a part of me, a reminder of the beauty of unexpected connections, of the quiet magic that had brought us together, if only for a fleeting moment in time.